Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Stream of Consciousness. I'm your host, Conscious Caracal, Adams van Sale, joined here tonight by a very prestigious guest, a guest that I have a lot of respect and admiration for, R.W. Johnson. I think a lot of you might also recognize his name. I've shared a lot of his writing, and I know a lot of you that are well acquainted with South African politics and what's going on here will have definitely seen his name somewhere in your reading if you've been reading anything on what's happening in South Africa. But maybe just a quick introduction for those of you that are unaware. So R.W. Johnson is one of South Africa's foremost political scientists, and as I said earlier, also one of my favorite authors. Some of Johnson's most well-known books include South Africa, The First Man, The Last Nation, South Africa's Brave New World, How Long Will South Africa Survive, The Looming Crisis, and many, many more. Mr. Johnson, welcome on the program. I'm very honored to be speaking to you here tonight.
Well, that's very nice of you. They're quite unnecessary. Please call me Bill. Most people do.
All right, 100%. Thank you very much, Bill. So, Bill, you started off with, you wrote recently, it's not your most recent piece. Your most recent piece for Politics Web was also very good. But one of your recent pieces was specifically about the mythologizing of the decolonization of Africa and African nations and that little aspect of history. And I found it fascinating and a topic that not a lot of people have been discussing. You delved into it very deeply, and that's why I wanted to use my platform to give you a bit more exposure to add to that idea of the mythologizing of the decolonization of Africa. I think it explains a lot about what's going on today, ideologically and historically, and it also has a lot of lessons in it for South Africa specifically, as you point out in your second part of that two-part series. And that's what I wanted to talk to you here about tonight. But before we get into that, I identified it as an important topic. But why did you feel at the time that this was something that you needed to put pen to paper on, this topic?
Well, for the reasons you've just given, really, that I don't think it is widely understood here. And that, one of the sad things is that even now it is true that very few South Africans, and I include in that the government and its supporters, they've not really studied Africa. Very few of them seem to have read any serious books about, say, French West Africa or Francophone West Africa, I should say, or even Portuguese Africa. I mean, they went through these places, they saw a certain amount, but they don't actually have much information. And what they have is pretty dodgy, actually.
And the thing about that part of history, Bill, is the fact that it informs so much of the political rhetoric that we see today in South Africa, and also all the international rhetoric surrounding Africa specifically. That's why I also wanted to highlight the topic, and to ease us into it, I wanted to read one of your quotes from your first piece, and maybe hear some of your thoughts on that. So the quote starts with, if you happen to strategically reflect for a moment or two about this first generation of liberation fighters, you realize that very few of them did any actual fighting, and that those who did, like the Algerian FLN and the guerrilla movements in the three Portuguese African colonies, were most unlikely to attend English language conferences like the All African Peoples Conference in Accra in 1958. The fact is that most of Africa got independence without any sort of fight. The real hard work was done by others. Could you elaborate a bit on this? I mean, it's already a type of sentiment that if you are not well versed in history and only look at it emotionally, already this might get some African nationalists hot under the collar.
Well, I'm not particularly bothered about whether people like or dislike it, but let's just look at the facts. You see, there is a sort of mythology that Nkrumah came to power in what was then the Gold Coast, became Ghana, in 1957, and stood up for decolonization and pan-Africanism, and was a radical African nationalist. And that then the walls of Jericho began to fall, and that people who style themselves as liberation fighters are actually usually African nationalist politicians whose fighting consisted of making speeches and rallying their supporters and getting votes in elections, but sometimes going to jail for brief periods, nobody for very long. And that is their sort of cursus honorum of how it was all won. Now, that is not really correct. If you go back, the origins of decolonization really stem from two particular things. One is early on in the Second World War, when Churchill was desperately trying to get Roosevelt to give help to Britain fighting all on its own. And of course, he wanted the Americans to come into the war. He met with Roosevelt on the Atlantic, and they came in two battleships. And Roosevelt said, okay, well, look, I can't declare war to help you, but not now. I'm very sympathetic. But what we can do is we could sign a common statement which says that we and you agree on certain basic principles and that we will defend them and stand up for them. So, of course, Churchill was only too happy to do that. And Roosevelt had brought with him such a statement, and they sort of argued over it a bit. But what resulted from that was the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter said there has to be self-determination of all peoples. Now, you can imagine that wasn't really Churchill's first thought. He was a keen imperialist. But this was Roosevelt's advance notice that the Americans were not prepared to support colonialism, imperialism, that they were an anti-colonial force. That was their origins as a country, and that they had frankly suffered during the 1930s because the French and British had shut their empires to them and had made sure that they alone did all the trading and investing and so forth within those closed economic zones. And the result was that the depression was much, much steeper in countries without colonies, Germany and America, and it was less steep in Britain and France. Now, knowing that, he wanted to open these places up and make sure that the price for American support was going to be decolonization. And Churchill, however reluctantly, signed on to that. Now, that was a most crucial document, and that went round the world, and Asian and African elites noticed it thoroughly and quoted it and said, look, you see, we ought to have self-determination. And they agree. So come on, let's have it. And it really helped feed that nationalist surge after the Second World War. The second such thing was when de Gaulle was basically had to flee from France to Britain and set up the Free French movement against the Nazis. The only bit of the French Empire to rally to him was Equatorial Africa under a black administrator, Felix Eboué. And he came out for the Free French. Most of the colonies came out for Vichy France. And de Gaulle, of course, was very, very pleased and went down to Brazzaville, opposite the Congo, and early in the war signed the Brazzaville Declaration. And the Brazzaville Declaration said that, you know, it was tremendously good that Africa or any part of it was supporting the Free French, and that this was the way ahead, and that France in return would not forget this and would reward such support after the war by moves to liberalize the administration of Francophone Africa and to give a much greater degree of self-determination. So that Brazzaville Declaration echoed the Atlantic Charter. And of course, the French and British were the two biggest colonial powers in Africa by far. And that also set the ball rolling. And in French Africa, that was even more sort of decisive, I think, for a lot of would-be nationalists than the Atlantic Charter. They tended to notice that more. Now, those are the two things that really started the process going. And Nkrumah was a beneficiary of that process. But when I talked about people, liberation fighters, really, I think that the most important liberation fighters were in Vietnam, because Indochina was a key French colony, not only Vietnam, of course, but Laos and Cambodia. And the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, set up their own government in 1945 and were sort of driven out by the French, but gradually launched a war of liberation against the French. And this was a very, very bitter and tough war, and led to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Now, Dien Bien Phu, I don't suppose many South Africans even know about it, but it was one of the most important battles of the 20th century. Basically, what was happening was that the Viet Minh were fighting a guerrilla war against the French, quite effectively, and the French were taking a lot of casualties. And they were furious, as people tend to be fighting guerrillas, saying, you know, why don't they stand and fight? They always attack us in the dark and then they're gone, and so on, you see. And in the end, what the French did was to deliberately create a large base in the very middle of Vietnam called Dien Bien Phu, knowing that that base would be bound to dominate the whole central area of Vietnam. And that if the Viet Minh wanted to do anything to advance their cause, they were going to have to come out and fight a proper pitched battle with the French in order to attack that base and try and take it. And the French assumption was that they, of course, would win any such battle. And Ho Chi Minh gathered his men and finally launched exactly that, a big attack on Dien Bien Phu, and the French were well prepared and fought back and used air power and so on. But gradually, the Viet Minh won completely and took Dien Bien Phu. And that ended the war. It was a decisive victory. And it went around the world as a tremendous shock that Asian guerrillas, you know, people without uniforms or anything like that, had conquered a leading industrialized country in a straightforward battle, which the French had actually tried to provoke. They were so confident, and yet they were beaten hands down. Now, I think Dien Bien Phu was absolutely crucial. It was a warning not only to the French, but the British, the Dutch, the Portuguese, anyone with colonies, that look, you know, this is a very serious movement of anti-colonial resistance, and we might face something like that. And of course, the French then went on to face something of the same in Algeria. So I think that those battles by the Vietnamese on the one hand, and above all the Vietnamese, and then the Algerians, were actually vital. And the British and others were all paying great attention to them, even though they weren't involved. And they knew that they must, above all costs, avoid those sort of situations arising in the areas they controlled. So you see, I think those were the decisive things in pushing along decolonization. But of course, at the same time, both the Americans and the Russians were exerting strong pressure
Right.
for the decolonization as well. And they were on the Security Council, and they were in a good position to do so. And, you know, I think that combination was what really led to decolonization. And, you know, I think that African nationalists were just the beneficiaries of that largely. They didn't have to fight in most cases. I mean, Nkrumah didn't have to fight. That's what I was talking about.
Yeah, and to add to that point, Bill, you mentioned in your article that so rapid was this process of decolonization almost overnight that for example, in Nigeria, leaders actually asked for a short delay before independence was declared. In fact, you also write there in your piece that the era of African independence had begun before there was even many African parties or leaders asking for it. That adds to your idea that you already said there, but specifically, this whole idea of even some African leaders saying we need to slow down the process, we're not ready for that type of transition yet. It completely goes against any type of narrative surrounding decolonization. All you hear is that all of these regimes, all of these leaders, all of these countries were just chomping at the bit ready for this process of decolonization. But as you highlight in your piece, this wasn't the case very often.
Well, the point is that, inevitably, some areas were more advanced than others. Senegal, being the most developed, most well-educated, the most best assimilated country in French West Africa, clearly led the way, and things then spread to other parts of Francophone Africa, but particularly in Central and Equatorial Africa, things were very much slower. But the same was true, of course, in the rest of Africa. West Africa tended to lead the way. East Africa was slower, and Southern Africa slower still. But in this country, it wasn't really until Lutuli took over as ANC leader in, I think it was 52, that the ANC really began to pick up speed. The period from 45 to 52, there was not a lot happening, actually. And it was really only in the 50s that the ANC began to grow into a serious mass movement. And it was slow. And, I remember my friend Jill Wenzel in Joburg saying how her husband used to get nagged by Nelson Mandela when he called a stay away or a strike, because Ernie Wenzel, her husband, was the head of the Liberal Party in what was then the Transvaal. And believe it or not, in those days, the Liberal Party had a bigger and better organization in Soweto than the ANC. And so Mandela would come to him and say, you must support our stay away, you must support the strike, because he knew that he couldn't manage without them. But that was how weak the ANC was, even in the middle 50s. They needed to do that. And so, obviously, not everything happened all at once. And, it doesn't in any way undermine the sort of African movement towards independence, the fact that the Nigerians wanted to delay it a bit. They had other things to think about. There was this delicate regional balance, and they wanted to try and get that right before they were independent. And, quite right, too. But
the West just wanted to get this over with and make sure that the sooner we decolonize Africa, the sooner we can have a clean conscience. Seems like the message.
Well, it wasn't a conscience. No, I think conscience wasn't quite it. Look, it was for the British. It was Suez. What happened at Suez, where they found themselves at odds with the Americans, and the Americans drew back and wouldn't support the pound. And Eden was forced out of power by a tremendous attack on the currency as a result. Was a horrible, horrible experience. And they vowed we must never again get ourselves into a position where we lose the support and confidence of our most important ally. And that was what had happened at Suez. And of course, the Americans made it clear, look, you've got to decolonize. And you can't go throwing your weight around in Egypt over this canal. And Nasser is quite right. That canal runs through his country. It belongs to him, not you. And, you better behave accordingly. Now, from that moment on, when Macmillan came to power in 57 in Britain, he immediately instructed his colonial secretary, Ian MacLeod, you've got to push on with all speed you possibly can to decolonize as quickly as you can. And hurry, 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 And they were, from that point on, it was catch-up stuff, And MacLeod annoyed the right wing of the Tory party because he pushed so hard And in particular, in the case of Kenya, where many of them had connections, this is extremely unpopular. But nonetheless, that's how it happened. In France, it wasn't quite the same. But of course, there, what was happening was that they were fighting this dreadful war in Algeria. And what would happen would be that in French West Africa, leaders like Sékou Touré and Houphouët-Boigny and Senghor would say, you see, you've got to give us independence, otherwise we will become another Algeria. Now, this was basically bluff. They didn't have the capacity to do what the FLN did, and they didn't make any attempt to do so. But nonetheless, the French had got the point that they could not afford to be facing resistance throughout their colonies. They had to move quickly. And of course, when de Gaulle came to power in 1958, immediately Africans said, what about the Brazzaville Declaration? And he said, you're quite right. We are going to move ahead and give self-determination. And what happened then was that within 2 years, he gave self-determination to the whole of Africa. Guinea became independent in 1958, most of the others in 1960. But it was de Gaulle fulfilling his word and trying to head off trouble. He knew that Algeria was quite enough to deal with.
And Bill, one of the central points of your article was not just detailing how these how these independent countries came to be, or how these independence movements, how history moved in regards to this. You also go into detail some of the more disturbing and troubling results of many of these decolonization projects. I mean, you mentioned quite a few examples, but there's one line that I'd like to read from your piece where you say, once in power, most of these liberation leaders did not behave like heroes. And you mentioned many examples, Nkrumah of Ghana, Guinea's Sékou Touré, Milton Obote of Uganda, Mugabe of Zimbabwe. The list goes on. Could you elaborate a bit on the bitter fruits of some of these liberation movements that actually goes countercurrent to the beautiful myths that are being spun around them? The actual reality is a lot more stark and frank.
Yeah, well, look, during the nationalist movement where they were demanding independence and so forth, all of these leaders, naturally, as anyone in their position would, they would demand, say, look, we are the majority. We demand democracy, i.e., we must be allowed to win because we've got the numbers. And so they would speak the language of democracy and human rights, saying, you know, you must not stop us by jailing us or detaining us or any of these other restrictions which are operated. And they would use that language all the time. Now, once they actually got power, all of that dropped away. They weren't interested in democracy. Most of them created one-party states. Almost invariably, they went in for detention without trial. And they weren't interested in having competitive elections or anything like that. It was so. I think that was a common case in all of the, certainly all the radical states. The only states which were true to their word in the sense that they held regular free elections were those minority of African states which opted for a more capitalist direction, didn't go for any form of socialism. The vast majority went for some form of socialism, pan-Africanism, etc. But a few, Ivory Coast, Kenya, Nigeria, Botswana, Mauritius, opted from the beginning for a more capitalist form of development. And it was a form of liberal capitalism. They had regular free elections in all those countries. And they've continued to do so. So, I mean, that was a very different thing. In that sense, those countries did, at least to some extent, live up to their demands for democracy and human rights. But most of them didn't.
And yeah, to add to that, I mean, you also write here about the common pattern that you observed was a combination of, or historically observed, was the combination of corruption, mismanagement, and a general lack of maintenance. Meant that by the time their successors appeared, the potholes, power cuts, water shortages, and a whole raft of other problems had appeared. And you make a connection between these problems and this falling apart of infrastructure to a very specific phenomenon of state dependency and then also social inequality growth that you see within many of these post-colonial societies. And you cite one writer here, Dumont, and just to read one more piece that from your article before we elaborate a bit more. So you write in your piece that Dumont was struck by the way how a bureaucratic bourgeoisie had assumed power in most of these post-colonial countries. Analysis of parliamentary and cabinet elites showed a preponderance of former teachers, civil servants, and the like, which in turn meant that public service workers, the educated elite of most societies, derived continuing advantages from their proximity to political power. Moreover, this educated elite also ran the state-owned enterprises. In both cases, this enabled the elite considerable opportunities for the primary accumulation of capital through corruption. So the key characteristic of this new bourgeoisie was its dependency on the state. And I mean, many of my South African listeners already start hearing many parallels to what we're observing here. But before we get to that specific parallel, could you elaborate a bit more on this idea of Dumont, this emergence of this almost new political class in many of these post-colonial societies?
Yes, René Dumont was a French agronomist who wrote this very influential book, came out about 1962, I think, called L'Afrique Noire est mal partie, which means Africa has made a bad start. And that was where he drew attention to what he called the rise of this bureaucratic bourgeoisie and said, look, you know, this is everywhere. This is the group which has taken over, and it is not willing to give up power. And there's a certain inevitability about it. These are the only educated people in the country, more or less, and they are essential to running the state and state organizations of any kind. So they're absolutely in a dominant position in the new society. And they are using that to feather their nest in every way they can. And as you say, one result of this was a dramatic increase in inequality. I mean, if you go back to pre-colonial Africa, inequality was not great. The difference between a chief and a tribesman was not all that great. The chief would live in a hut in just the same way. He'd have much the same diet. He had some more privileges that the tribesman didn't have. He probably owned a few slaves, and he probably had more wives. But apart from that, their style of life and so on was, they hunted the same game. There wasn't a huge inequality there. Now, then you get the colonial period, and there's an increase in inequality because the colonial administrators from France or Britain, they are paid and paid quite well compared to certainly any Africans earning money. And they have more privileges. They get paid holidays back in France or Britain. They get pensions, and they, generally speaking, have motor cars. But that was it. None of them were rich men. None of them became rich. Even the governors of the colonies didn't accumulate great wealth. So, I mean, the inequality was considerable, but it was still limited. Now, if you then look at independent Africa, there's an enormous increase in inequality because the new elite goes to town feathering its nest, particularly the presidents, of course, but many of the ministers as well. The corruption is enormous. And you get, Mobutu in the Congo was a multi-billionaire. So is Dos Santos in Angola. So is Nguema in Equatorial Guinea. And you would find that even quite ordinary presidents, even those of quite poor countries, are all multimillionaires. And ministers are very frequently wealthy people too. Now, this is usually via corruption, although not only, because one of the things, of course, is a tremendous increase in salaries for that group. Kenyan MPs, for example, are among the very most highly paid parliamentarians anywhere in the world. Their salaries are certainly higher than British MPs or French ones. I think they're probably higher than Americans, congressmen. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. They reward themselves in all sorts of ways. And you find this sort of pattern in many African countries. So the inequalities now are absolutely staggering. So, I mean, we have a president who fits this entirely. I mean, you know, Ramaphosa is one of the very richest men in the country. His brother-in-law is even richer. And his sister-in-law is one of the richest women in Africa. I mean, you've got a plutocratic elite now in charge, which is what you've got in most African countries. You know, that the president of Mozambique was the richest man of the country there. Dos Santos was certainly the richest man in Angola. He was even regarded as one of the richest men in Brazil, which is sort of offshore Angola, in the same way that Florida and Miami are offshore Latin America. And I mean, even his daughter was worth $3.5 billion. So you can imagine what Dos Santos himself was worth. So, I mean, the inequality, the growth of inequality is, it's everywhere. And it's not just in the capitalist, liberal capitalist African countries, it's in all of them. You know, I mean, I remember I was in Guinea and I met Secretary, and his brother was a minister. Now, Secretary was very left-wing, but his brother was even more left-wing. And he was also doing a tremendous amount of smuggling and became very, very rich by smuggling all the tobacco that was grown there out of the country. And I mean, it was all criminal activity. And yet he was simultaneously spouting Marxism, Leninism, and so forth. Now, we've seen all of this in South Africa. The Zuma faction is simultaneously spouting far left stuff and stealing for everything it can. So is the EFF. This is very typical of a certain sort of African populism. And, you know, it's been seen all over the continent. It isn't specific to here. Similarly, if you look at inequality, of course, the ANC always talks as if inequality is the inheritance of apartheid. But this isn't true. It's actually got much more pronounced under ANC rule. Let's face it, none of the apartheid prime ministers or presidents were very rich men. None of them were anything like as rich as Ramaphosa is. And, you know, they weren't rewarded in the way. I mean, Zuma, clear, we don't know how much money Zuma left office with, but it was clearly a very great deal. And, you know, that's been the pattern. You know, we are certainly following the same pattern.
And Bill, you mentioned in your piece also something that I didn't consider before, but it's something that once you think about it, you start seeing it everywhere on the continent, and that is the rent seekers and the anti-rent seeker industry that has developed in many of these countries. Could you explain a little bit that phenomenon? I think South Africans might find it familiar, but many of my international listeners might not. It might not sound so familiar to them, that specific phenomenon.
Yes, well, look, I think you know what rent seeking is. It's the attempt to spy economic opportunities which don't necessarily have anything to do with you, but to exact some form of rent. Look, I'll give you an example. If you, let's say, I mean, it'd be true in any big South African city, but I know it's true here in Cape Town. If you decide that you're going to build some houses in some part of Khayelitsha, then the minute that you say that you're going to do this, you will find, first of all, of course, you will find people who put themselves forward saying they are the representatives of the community and that you can't do anything like this unless you have the consent of the community, which means their consent. And they wish to tell you who will be employed in building the houses, and it will be people that they specify. And of course, if you go down that route, they will get quite a big kickback from the people that are employed that way. And of course, who is to get the houses? And they will again try to put themselves forward as middlemen and gatekeepers to control these things and to cream off some sort of rent or reward of one kind or another. And you know, this is just the nature of things, that this attempt is always made, and often with the threat of force or violence if you don't comply, and so on. Now, you know, that sort of behavior you'll find all over Africa, and it's quite common. And when I say the anti-rent seeking agency, of course, this leads to corruption of various kinds. So you then get NGOs, or well-meaning kind, trying to fight against this sort of rent seeking, and that's good that they should, but it's I'm afraid the only thing that can stop it is very determined political action, which says, you know, we won't pay any attention to this, but and put your foot down. But you know, often that doesn't happen. But I think this rent-seeking instinct, if you want to call it that. Look, I think the point is that traditional African society was a patronage-based society where power was in the hands of the chief, and he handed out land, he handed out this, that, and the other. And therefore, the way that you got on in life was achieving some degree of patronage and putting yourself forward to the patron in a way saying, I can help you achieve your objectives, i.e., but I need them to be rewarded. And so it leads to that style of rent seeking, yeah. And it's again, you'll find it all over the place.
Right. And just to add to your explanation there, Bill, you also write in your piece, which I found very interesting, is specifically on this anti-rent seeking phenomenon. So you use the example of Kenya, and you say because the flower farms, they were profitable, they attracted a constant stream of state officials of every kind, all attempting to make difficulties for the farm so that they could then be bribed to go away. Something that we here in South Africa, if anyone that lives in Africa knows that this is a reality. Most of the farmers employed African staff whose full-time duty it was to deal with these rent seekers and then get them off the farm for nothing or as cheaply as possible. Thus, these anti-rent seekers also owed their jobs to the existence of this parasitic activity. Now, that's what I found very insightful, that very interesting, is an entire industry of anti-rent seekers, the people that are now tasked with keeping these government officials away from the farms or getting them to go away for as little bribe as possible, has become an entire industry in and of itself in many of these post-colonial countries. But to move on to another point that you make that I think it's so pertinent to the type of rhetoric that we hear in South Africa specifically today. So in South Africa, from all across the political spectrum, but specifically the more left-wing spectrum, the EFF and the ANC, you hear these utopian ideas of pan-Africanism, a borderless Africa, one African currency, one African government. Pan-Africanism is this utopian idea that you hear a lot about, but you can just watch any clip of the Pan-African Parliament, and there you have the same politicians like Julius Malema that talks about Pan-Africanism, telling other African leaders that he wants to kill them or he's going to kill them. I mean, I remember that clip from last year or about 2 years ago, him screaming over the floor that he has malicious intent towards his fellow African leaders there, I think going as far as threatening their lives. But you also touch on Pan-Africanism in your piece, and you say there that African countries have continued to subdivide, not unite. And why I think this is so pertinent and relevant is here we have again in a country like, for example, Sudan, where we're already having again subdividing forces, not uniting forces, causing a lot of chaos. Could you share some of your thoughts on the pan-Africanism ideal, and give us some of your frank realism in that regard?
Well, I think that it's not a realistic notion. Africa is a gigantic continent. The idea that it's going to unite into one thing is absurd. It isn't. And, you have to ask yourself, there's no movement wanting to unite Asia into one group. There's no movement trying to unite all of Latin America into one thing. Why does this come up for Africa, And it's a romantic idea that all Africans are sort of similar, and Africa for the Africans and so forth. But it's nonsense. And of course, if you look, you will see that we have already seen Sudan divide into two. You've just had a war in Ethiopia where Tigray was trying to secede. Eritrea has already seceded from Ethiopia. Mayotte has seceded from the Comores, and so on, and we've had endless wars in the Congo where particular bits, starting with Chombe and so forth, have wanted to secede. And, one does look at the Congo and think, well, sooner or later that will happen, that it's far too big a country. No one can control it properly. The only possible peaceful and successful future would be for it to subdivide, and you would then get manageable units. I mean, that would seem to me the best possible way ahead for them. But, I think that very big African countries like Sudan or Nigeria, there's just an intrinsic problem. I mean, Nigeria's already had one very bad civil war. There's continuous difficulty fighting, violence regionally. It frankly would have been better as a couple of separate countries. It would have certainly been a more peaceful solution. And I think that is generally true. So I think that's more likely to be the future. But of course, the big problem really is that, under colonial rule, Africa was pretty peaceful, the so-called Post-colonial. You could have walked from Cape Town to Suez without too much difficulty, actually. You could have hitched and run. But nowadays, you would have to go through quite a few war zones. You couldn't do it. And, this is a reality of independent Africa, is that since independence, wars have become a pretty normal feature of life in Africa. We've got these jihadist wars going on now in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on. And very bad they are too. We've got the Wagner Group in Central African Republic, in Chad and Sudan, and so forth. This is the reality that maintaining the peace is a difficult and full-time job now.
I think that would be a great way to end off this conversation, specifically on what can we learn. I mean, there's already a lot that you covered that we can learn from, but to zero in specifically on South Africa, what is there that you think we can learn from this era?
Well, in a way, that's too big a question. Basically, what I'm saying is that what people need to do is to study Africa and its evolution since the Second World War. And, not many people in this country have really done that. And to understand its evolution and to realize that the ANC is simply following a very sort of, a pretty predetermined path, that they are remaking many of the same mistakes that were made elsewhere. They said when they came to power that they had seen all the mistakes made by other African countries and would now know how to avoid them. Well, that was completely untrue. They've completely followed the same route. I think that, look, I think the main thing is that at the moment, South Africans tend to look at everything that goes on as we are an exception to everything, and that they have to learn everything from scratch, as if it hasn't happened anywhere else before. But it has. It's happened here in Africa, and many things which we have lived through, we would have felt rather differently about if we had known a bit more about the recent comparative history of a lot of African countries. For example, many of the independence era leaders fancied themselves as sort of philosopher kings, and starting with Nkrumah, and came out with books about pan-Africanism and consciencism and redefining their take on African socialism and all that sort of thing. And lots of them did this. And there was a period when this was all taken very seriously. I don't think anyone takes it at all seriously now. No one reads those books or pays any attention to them. Now, Mbeki was our philosopher king. He tried to be like this too, both in his speeches and so forth, to be the one who was articulating it all and so forth. Now, if you'd known more about how things had worked elsewhere in Africa, then frankly, this wouldn't have been treated with the degree of deference that it was here, which it was. And people would have been a bit more conscious of those comparisons. And I think that's all I would really say, that we ought to understand that we're just simply following a path already trodden by others. But we are nearing the end of an era. I mean, it is now clear, surely completely clear, that the whole African nationalist project has failed. We're ending up in a situation where there's not enough electricity, there's not enough water, where there are potholes rather than roads. The whole place is falling to bits, and this government has failed completely. And no matter what they say, the prospect is for it to continue failing and to fail worse. There's no real possibility that they can turn this around, I don't think. I don't personally, I have a strong feeling that we are now nearing the end of an era, roughly a 30-year era. And things are going to have to change one way or the other, because if we carry on like this, then the country could well split up, could be taken over by warlords, mafia lords, whatever you want. The government will control less and less. We've seen this before in Africa, where, in the end, the central government controls the main capital city and the road to the airport, and that's about it. And, we're not quite there yet, but we are moving in that direction. And so, the era which began with Mandela is ending very badly, but it's difficult for me to believe that it won't be replaced by something else. I don't know what, but within a measurable future,
Bill, I'd like to give you a final question, and it's not a question regarding specifically your piece or the topic, but rather as someone that clearly loves history and has a very strong sense for history and doesn't, in Afrikaans you'd say, nie doekies omdraai about it, and you don't beat around the bush when it comes to history. Could you maybe end with a message on why it is important to know your history, read your history, not just for romantic stories and mythology, but rather to know what's going on, or the history of not just South Africa, but the continent around you, and to know all the facts, the beautiful facts, and also the harder, difficult ones. Just a final thought there on the importance of knowing your history.
Well, I mean, you've said it yourself. I mean, that's I mean, in phrasing the question, you've given the answer, really, that you don't, certainly it shouldn't be in order to glorify things or to mythologize things, but to try to understand the underlying processes which were at work and which produce certain results, and then to see that they are at work in your own country, and that gives you a better understanding of them and even prepares you a bit for what could happen next. And, I think that's, we've been incredibly naive in South Africa. We have to learn everything from scratch as if it's never happened anywhere before. That's just ridiculous, really. And we should have been able to see a lot of these things coming. Anyway, that's all I can really say.
Well, Bill, thank you very much for your valuable time and your valuable insights and knowledge. I really appreciate it, and the audience, I know, appreciates it as well. I hope you have an excellent rest of your evening, and I also want to encourage everyone that listened, if you enjoyed this conversation, go read R.W. Johnson's pieces on specifically Politics Web. There's also a wealth of books. You don't even have to go look very far. Either secondhand bookstore or even the new bookstores, stores, you can find a plethora of Mr. Johnson's books there. I would actually recommend to go look in secondhand bookstores. You will find it for a very good price there, and there's always South Africa is fraught with your works, Mr. Johnson. So it's not too hard to come by, which I think is an excellent thing. So I would highly encourage that, and also keep an eye on the Politics website for Mr. Johnson's latest pieces of analysis. There's two links.
Actually, now on Biz News, I also write for them.
All right. Keep an eye on Biz News as well. That's another platform where Mr. Johnson writes. And then check in the description for the two pieces that we discussed here tonight. We only scratched the surface. There's a lot more to go in there. So go read those pieces for yourself and share them. And Mr. Johnson, finally, again, thank you for your time. And I really appreciate that you could share your knowledge of history with us here tonight.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye. Cheers, everyone, and have a great weekend and a great week.
Okay, you too.
Goodbye, and God bless.
Okay.